The following is taken from the writings of John Michael Fall before his untimely death in 1992. It is a response to an unknown correspondent regarding his memories of the evacuation of Highgate School to Devon, as well as his own wartime memories. Highgate School, 1938 onwards. My own school generation was that which joined the junior school in 1938. New bugs, aged around 9. Naturally, memories of the 1938 evacuation are in consequence skimpy. I went to Highgate as a weekly boarder, and everything seemed very strange, as to any new boy who has not yet got used to his surroundings or had time to make friends. Thus the upset of a move to Totnes in Devon did not perhaps seem very much of an upset to my year, within the context of a world that was new in all respects anyway. It seemed more like an extension of the summer holiday just ended. The trips down and back again by coach I can recall, as that I sat with another new bug, Derek Joyce, later generally nicknamed Fizzy, because his endless exuberance tired out even the rest of his group. But I remember little of the time at Totnes beyond a trip to inspect the parish church. This stays in my memory, I think, because we had spent our summer holiday nearby, and the family had made a similar inspection a few weeks earlier. So if there had to be an evacuation, Totnes was probably the place most likely to seem welcoming to me, because of a slight familiarity and the sense of a link with home. Thus, by the time we returned to London, we were no longer total strangers, and the incident had let us into school routine in a particularly gentle manner. I do not have any recollections between that point and the end of the 1939 summer term, which are specifically related to war preparations in the context of Highgate. Indeed, if you could go back to that time, I doubt that you would find any such traces which a 9-year-old living within the sheltered community of a boarding school could have picked up, apart from odd references in the daily papers which you were just old enough to begin to want to read. But there are some memories of preparations for war, the testing of air raid sirens, my OC father in his auxiliary fire service uniform, a very up-to-date dinky toy model of a trailer-mounted barrage balloon, complete with winch cable drum and capable of being set to leave the balloon at any height desired, dinky searchlights, etc. The digging of shelters in parks. I also remember the IRA bombing campaign of the time, in which they blew a section out of the side of the aqueduct over the North Circular Road, near the Brill Cream factory. The patch was discernible as a differently coloured concrete until quite recently, but I could not detect it when I had a look a year or so ago. We will also all remember the tuck shop on the school field just behind the junior school, where my chief delight was Lyon's fruit pies, then retailing at 2d a time. The junior school magazine, to which I unwittingly contributed when Mr. Hamilton decided that my French howler was of the required standard for the howlers page. Toujours means today, and journée means tomorrow. We spent our 1939 summer holiday on a farm near Pathelly, close to the sea. It was from there that we set out for Westward Ho, on September the 2nd, after the school's notice had appeared in the Times. It was an uncomfortable journey for 2 reasons. The road system does not make for an easy journey from North Wales to North Devon, and my father was worried about the difficulties of getting petrol to cover the trip down and then back also to London, there being a rumour that petrol would be rationed at once. He therefore purchased drums to contain as much petrol as possible, and these rode with us, necessitating driving with open windows to reduce the fume level, None of it was used en route, and the whole consignment reached home in the end. We reached Taunton at tea time and spent the night there, having to share a double bed between the three of us, as there was almost no accommodation to be had. We visited W.H. Smith's, and my parents bought me a copy of Westward Ho, which Dan Petit read aloud in class during the ensuing term or two. I still have it. We reached Buckley, the gathering point for the junior school in Westward Ho, just before 11 a.m, and my first memory of the evacuation is in fact listening to Mr. Chamberlain's declaration of war at 11 a.m, minutes after we arrived. I do not recall how long we stayed at Buckley, nor anything of the move to Hartland Abbey. I have been surprised to read that the youngest boys stayed on at Westward Ho for a time. Few boys suffered from homesickness for very long after the initial partings, but certainly one or two could not settle, and finally left for London and home. How to describe Hartland from a boy's point of view? Boys differ in their likes and dislikes, but to me it was near to paradise, as it was to many others, without any doubt. I well remember the masses of snowdrops you mention, on the west bank of the stream, on the coast side of the Abbey. Despite war, and no doubt it may now seem incredible, but I and others were able to send boxes of them home by post, where they were received sufficiently quickly still to be in good condition. Try that today. They grew amongst the fringe of the woodland covering that side of the valley, and I hope still flourish. Who else remembers the 1940 summer holiday at Hartland, sleeping on the field at the back of the Abbey in tents, or the lines we set at night in the stream, the trout and eels we landed and later ate, all before we went over to Westward Ho? I have no memory of the urinals you mentioned situated in the backyard, but I'm sure that every one of us will recall the first floor toilets within the building. That at the west end was in a wide alcove and covered by a side-to-side mahogany panel, which included the seat and a recess in which was a handle you pulled up in order to flush the antique but serviceable monster. At the east end was a room of more normal proportions, where there was entertainment for evermore. The walls were papered with old Punch cartoons, including the famous ones about the bishop and Mr. Jones the curate, whose egg was good in parts, and about the two elderly kilted Scots at the London terminus, where one is describing that he had been barely in London half an hour, when bang went saxpence. I know that we were not particularly thoughtful in our use of the toilets, as Doody, who taught my father before 1914, as well as myself in my turn, once gave the whole school a lecture on how toilets blocked up and how unpleasant it was for Dan Petit to have to unblock them. The backyard certainly contained an outbuilding which housed the generator. This occasionally failed when it ran out of fuel, or if too many lights were on at one time, though we soon realised that it was usually recovered if we rushed to turn a few off during the period when it gave an increasingly dim light. But I recollect holding a torch for a master on occasion, whilst he got the thing going again. Today we take electricity for granted, as also mains water and sewerage, but these are all post-war developments outside our towns and cities. I partly remember the internal layout of the Abbey, taken east to west on each floor. The basement, old cloister level, contained dining room and kitchen, shoe cleaning and storage rooms, plus various staff rooms, a passage running end to end on the back north side. On the ground floor, hall and main stairs up and down, two main front rooms, one of which, as you say, was panelled, These were classrooms and recreation rooms, and tuck boxes lined the walls. They had old-fashioned wide column radiators which made good seats on cold days, and folding wooden window shutters instead of curtains. Here we were taught, and here also we listened to the local priest and saw occasional film shows, had our end-of-term concerts and so on. The next main room was a dormitory known as Puffing Billy. Contests tended to be on a dormitory basis, as the usual house groupings had been abandoned. Beyond this were rooms we seldom saw, for Mr. Dumaresque, Doody, and his family, Mrs. Butler, and others. Mr. North had a room at the rear at the east end. On the first floor were similar rooms, mostly used as dormitories or by staff. There certainly was a large flock of peacocks and peahens at the Abbey. One bird alone stood out from the rest, an irascible cock named Henry. Once, when our crocodile was setting out for Sunday morning church, he landed an attack, landing on the shoulder of one poor unfortunate for a moment. But I don't recollect that it was Mr. Petit, and perhaps I remember another episode. I often hear peacocks calling from the other side of the Derbyshire village where I now live, and they stir memories of these times with their loud and raucous cries. The Abbey sits in a valley, the bottom being mostly fields, but the hills on both sides being woodland. The Abbey woods contained a fair rhododendron growth of considerable height and which looked most attractive in the flowering season. The woods contained a number of cedar and other trees which we found excellent for climbing. Dan Petit ran a highly successful scout troop, and many happy hours were spent following trails, cooking and so on in these woods under his auspices. But I do remember that when I'd finished cooking my potato for the second-class badge, he was nowhere to be found, and I ended up carrying it to him for approval in my handkerchief, all the mile and more down the path to the private beach, where he was having a swim with some other lads. Naturally, all the aspiring cooks passed their test. Another memory of the woods is the local farmer's rook hunt in the spring. There was a large rookery on the eastern hill, and they used a lot of shot to pepper the nests in an effort to break the eggs. A fair number of adult birds met their ends, and I think I can remember rook pie being on the menu after one of these hunts. Being in that part of Devon, there were naturally a number of deer in the winter in our woods that had found their way down from the moors. One I particularly remember, but never got near to, was a white stag. He came as near to the Abbey as the further edge of the field on the seaward side, but no nearer. Wise of him. We certainly had some very tasty venison more than once, hopefully obtained lawfully by the school supplier. Reverting for a moment to Puffing Billy, the Stuckley family had moved out of the Abbey and into the lodge at the entrance to the main drive for the duration of our stay. Naturally, this could not take all their belongings, and I recollect oil paintings on the walls of this room. One painting stopped a flying slipper in its canvas during a dawn fight, as I remember, causing somewhat of a row between the school and the Stuckleys, if the rumours that reached us were true. During the summer terms of 1940 and 1941, we enjoyed having a private beach very much, the masters, the mistresses, and the boys. I think it was a shingle beach, and the cliffs here, as elsewhere along the coast, showed the marvellous contorted patterns in their rock faces of primeval volcanic action. Stoke Quay was probably the spot where we saw these giant stone curved layers to best advantage, a spot we sometimes walked to. The mistresses were Miss Tristram and Miss Roberts. Miss Roberts had certainly been at Highgate before the war, but I do not remember Miss Tristram before our Hartland stay, or after. Our walks took us far and wide, not only those which we took for our own amusement, but those which were organised by Doody. We also used our cycles a lot. I remember blackberrying trips with Doody along the lanes and paths leading to Speake's Mill, and a half-term holiday all-day trip to Clovelly, though I think we must have had mechanical transport for a part of that one. The walk down through the Hobby Drive to that particularly quaint spot was delightful. We often went for walks into Hartland village, a mile or more away, where we spent our money in the shops. I had contacts who lived a mile or two on the other side of the village, some people from Hastings whom we'd met on holiday in 1938, who had rented a bungalow for the duration, and who often asked me out for Sunday afternoon tea. And then we walked by Crocodile to church at St Nectan's, Stoke, every Sunday. We called it the Golden Trail because the road outside the Abbey's back drive was invariably spattered with the tokens of the cattle who were taken along it. An uphill trudge this, the coming back being much more enjoyable. Your printer has misprinted the Vicar of Hartland's name. He was Ivan L. Gregory. He stands at the right of the enclosed photo, a man who seemed to favour the dress in which he is shown at all hours every day. He had a booming voice and a restless manner. He kept us under firm control during his talks to us at the Abbey, but I do not think his sermons were couched for our instruction, as I remember nothing about them. His main church was that at Stoke, though there was a small one within Hartland village. I forget the occasion for the photograph and why many of us were holding models of St Nectan's, but it had drawn the bishop and his chaplain to join the service. The picture also shows quite a number of local children at the front. I wonder who else has a copy. I have enclosed also a list of the people from school shown on the photo to whom I can still put names. Perhaps someone will be able to complete the list. St Nectan's could also be reached via a footpath through the Abbey grounds which ran up through the woods to the backside of the church, away from the side shown in the photo. The film shows I have mentioned. We saw plenty of Popeye the Sailor and of Corky the Cat in between projector breakdowns, but I don't remember what else was shown. Yes, there were bats. We found them flying about the Abbey at night, and quite a few were brought down with towels. Funny little things. Some of us finally found their hideout quite by chance. Above the main staircase was a small one which led up to a door into the roof space, and also to a door giving access to the outside of the roof. We found it rather interesting to explore the roof space, which we did with the aid of torches. On one visit we noticed a shaft going down, apparently, to the floor level below, so we created a rope ladder and set out to explore it. We found that the shaft gave access to a secret room, which was the bats' hideout. Unfortunately, we never really made any use of the room, or got rid of the bats, because, on emerging from the roof space, we were confronted by a master. Caught red-handed, we were lectured about the risk we had run of putting our feet through the ceilings, and found out that we had given ourselves away by tripping over bell wires we had not seen in time by torchlight. The bells in the basement thus set off had alerted the powers that be. The result was a caning all round at the hand of Mr. Markham. I can't say that I remember the Abbey news nor listening to Winston's Dunkirk broadcast, but I have a vivid recollection of the evening at Westward Ho in 1942, when he made his famous and defiant "some chicken, some neck" speech. The effect was electrifying amidst the gloom before the tide had turned, even though no one doubted that we should win in the end. We laughed and cheered and felt incomparably lifted and better. This was, of course, at a time when there was no television, and when everyone listened to the radio anxiously every day to keep up to date with the latest turns of events. War maps published by the daily papers, coming with a supply of British, German and Russian flags with pins, were all the rage with us at that time. The flags were moved daily to depict the ebb and flow of the various battlefronts. The 1940 winter was, as you say, something to live in our memories all our lives, just like that of 1947. There were vast quantities of snow at Hartland and intense cold. It is the only time I've seen wild birds lose their fear of man and seek shelter indoors. We brought several in, mostly pewits, finding them nearly frozen and sheltering in doorways or other openings. I also remember that Doody organised a mammoth snow fight on the back field. We built defensive positions with snow walls and had a high old time fighting it out. In milder weather, this field was used for soccer and cricket by turns. Although I remember John Lindsay, whose tragic death in a road accident in the early 1950s was so sad, I confess that I cannot remember the lost glass eye incident. We certainly had one season each year when marble games were in vogue. John, despite his glass eye, was always involved in things and generally popular, whilst he was not a special buddy of mine. Both of us were great friends with Michael Boreham. John and I both chose to become chartered surveyors, he taking the London course and I the Cambridge one. He was ahead of me and already at work in London, whilst I was still an undergrad. This was because his eye let him out of the need to serve in the forces for 2 years, an obligation I much enjoyed and only wish could continue today. It did nothing but good in so many ways for those who were not old enough to take part in the war. That is all I can relate, which is more or less directly related to your chapter 4. But there are other memories of the Hartland period which will help to fill out the story and perhaps be of use to you in any revision you may decide to carry out before producing the second edition, as I'm sure you will. I have only recently reread The Tale of a Red Deer, and which I recommend to anyone interested in the habits of the deer in that part of the country. As one came towards the Abbey from Hartland, there was a turning off to the right, heading towards Speke's Mill, etc. If one took this turning, it led you straight across the floor of the valley, and then bent left and climbed the hill on the other side. The main gate to the Abbey was at this left-hand bend, with the lodge beside. The walk down the drive was a lovely one through woods at any time, but particularly when the rhododendrons were in flower. If, on the other hand, one continued straight past the right turning, one soon came to the site of an old quarry on the left of the road, wherein were stored all the road signs of the district. I suppose there were similar stores everywhere. I imagine all these signs were uprooted after Dunkirk in order to ensure that if the Germans landed, they would not get any help over the ways to various places and the distances thereto. After a while, this road also climbed up its side of the valley through the woods and out onto the moorland-type fields above on the way to Stoke and to St Nectans. Part of the way up, there was a gateway on the right, which gave access to the back drive to the Abbey. This fell down through woodland, past the Abbey farm buildings, to the Abbey itself. The farm buildings and the farm hands were of much interest to a few of us, less to others. I remember that there was a kitten there, which was much beloved by Tom Catnap, though I cannot recollect who else went there. At Christmas 1939, we had a school party just before the end of term. The item that sticks in my mind was the fervent and hearty rendition of "There Will Always Be an England." In that first holiday, my parents took me to see the Crazy Gang at the London Palladium. The song was in their show too, as also Run Rabbit Run, with a chorus dressed as gun-toting land girls. There were, of course, many times when we had to amuse ourselves within the Abbey. For many, reading was a great amusement. I particularly recall a lot of happy hours sitting side by side with Ronald Frankenberg, reading our way through the Sherlock Holmes stories in thick red books with very thin pages. An aunt of mine gave them to me as presents over a period. The chief trouble was that Ron read a lot faster than I, so we seldom read the same page, and one of us had to hold up the in-betweens. I remember particularly on our walks how we were accompanied on windy days by the endless humming of the telephone wires. With next to no cars about, this was really the only noise there was, but I must say it seems strange that it should have made a sufficient impression to have stuck in my memory all these years. At Christmas 1940, my parents came down for a few days, and we stayed at the King's Arms in Hartland, where we stayed on some other holiday visits in this difficult period over the war. The hosts were Mr. and Mrs. Frayne. Mr. Frayne was a cloth-capped, rubicund farmer by day, and his wife a bustling, motherly soul. They had 2 children. Jill was little younger than I, and is, I think, the girl in the centre of the front row of the church photo. Her brother Christopher would have been about 3 years old and was a real little handful. Mrs. F. was an excellent cook, and one revelled in large dishes of homemade Devonshire cream with every suitable dish. My father ate so much on one occasion that he made himself poorly. This was the pub patronised by our masters. I also remember being invited to Sunday tea there on several occasions, an event that was most enjoyable, apart from the fact that Jill would insist that Ron Frankenberg and I play hopscotch with her. We never fathomed out her rules for the game. I remember calling there once when starting a cycling trip one day, perhaps at a half-term. Mrs. F. packed us off with extra food and a quart of cider she drew from the wood. I cannot remember who my companion was. In 1959, whilst on our honeymoon, Pauline and I went to the King's Arms for lunch one day. On my recollection of how happy times had been there 19-odd years before, as we walked in at the door, there was Mrs. Frayne coming up the hall. She stopped short and said, "Well, if it isn't Michael Fall!" She insisted that we had lunch on the house and treated us like royalty. Mr. Frayne was also much the same as ever, except that he was a little lame and walked with a stick. A lovely couple in every way. And then there were the Spitfire clubs. No doubt they flourished everywhere. We had several, and you got a lapel badge in return for a subscription. A fair amount of money must have been raised through the country to help pay for new fighters in this way. I also recollect that T.K. Jack, the elder son, was a very good whittler and reduced many odd pieces of wood to very passable models of Spitfires. I and others tried to do the same, but we had not the same touch. A similarly expert modeller friend at Westwood Ho later was John Hind. He produced some marvellous little field pieces fashioned out of odds and ends of brass. I think he probably made other things, but these old-time cannon are the ones that I remember. Somehow or other, my parents persuaded Doody to let me bring our dog to the Abbey for the September term in 1940. He was a smooth-haired terrier named Nipper. He had proved too highly strung to stand the sounds of war, air raid sirens, guns, planes, etc. I cannot remember how long he stayed there with us. nor what exactly proved to be the obstacle to his remaining an evacuee. Perhaps he was too excited by the company of so many boys, or perhaps it was the problem of keeping track of him. But the day finally came when I said goodbye to him in a vet's house on Bideford Quay. The vet had found him another home, but the recipients insisted that I, at any rate, was not to know where he was going to live. Various members of the Hartland party went to Bideford from time to time to the dentist, a lady named Mrs. Satchwell, whose surgery was towards the top end of the High Street, on the right-hand side as one went up. I remember her as an efficient and businesslike person. What happened to us in the holidays was mostly a matter of parental decision, but not entirely. That first term of the war was exceptionally long, running from September the 3rd to about December the 22nd. Some no doubt stayed in the Devon area with parents or friends, but most of us awaited the final morning with intense excitement. Heavy luggage went a day or two in advance by PLA, passenger luggage in advance, and we followed by coach at an unearthly hour before it grew light, arriving on Bideford station to join the seniors and board the train for London at about 7:30 a.m. A similar luggage drill followed on return journeys, but it only cost 1 6 to 7.5p to send a trunk home. PLA in those days. Matters changed with the fall of France and the commencement of meaningful air raids. Some boys no doubt still went home to London, whilst others went to other spots, but a fair number of us started our holiday at the Abbey. What could have been more pleasant for a group of boys than to have total freedom to do what they wanted and go where they wanted, subject only to the need to return for any meals taken in and for bed? The weather was, of course, excellent that summer. We spent many nights camping in tents on the field behind the Abbey, setting lines for trout in the nearby river. We bathed, we walked, we cycled far and wide. We played in the grounds and the woods. We played in the Abbey. I can recollect that the company included Eddie Brentnell and his brother, Theodore Goodland and Brian Whittard, but other faces have not stayed in my memory. We sunbathed and talked on the roof of the Abbey, and a search of it today would no doubt reveal where we carved our initials. As the company diminished, so it became necessary to transfer those remaining to Westward Ho, where we stayed at Ennisfarne in charge of KRG Hunt. Most of this part of the holiday I spent with Theo Goodland. We consumed enormous quantities of ice cream at the Beals Cafe, the ice cream parlour not having been taken over by the senior school at that stage. We wandered the length and width of the Pebble Ridge and the dunes behind, and we spent a lot of time digging a long sand tunnel through one of the dunes. One day we found 2 bomb-like objects with fins at the rear. On the side was an instruction that the finder should pierce at the spot marked with an X and throw into the water. We did. I've often wondered since what these things were, as it was in the days before the army came to Westward Ho. One day we waded the estuary and spent an hour or two on Braunton Sands on the Barnstaple side. We nearly came unstuck as the tide was running in quite strongly when we waded back, and we gave ourselves a bit of a scare as we waded across again. Need I say that we did not have a watch between us and were usually late for meals. Some part of that holiday I spent in a hotel at Bude with my mother, but that is no part of this tale. One of the problems for Doody was the beds on which we slept. They had wooden frames and legs, and the body was of 2-inch canvas webbing. This was no doubt fairly cheap, but it was not entirely serviceable where boys were concerned. Webbing will wear and snap anyway, but particularly under the guidance of seasoned hooligans like us. It did not really stand up to the tours round the dormitory without touching the floor, to fights, to general jumping or deliberate hooliganism. Duty battled ceaselessly to keep them repaired and serviceable, but undoubtedly considered that if the culprits had to sleep in discomfort for a few nights before repairs were effected, then they would be less likely to do the same things again. After Mr. North was called up, his room became a dormitory for 4, of whom I was one for a time. We felt very select and honoured to have thus graduated from the larger rooms, but we soon discovered that there was a rodent problem when someone found a slipper half chewed away one morning. We searched the skirtings and the floorboards. We looked at the gap under the door, and we could not trace any point at which our visitors could enter, so decided that they must come down the chimney. This was but one sign of what became a major problem by the time the school finally left in July 1941 for the last time. Rats. I think they no doubt came because of the vast increase in the supply of miscellaneous food scraps, sweets, cakes, etc. But those boys who did not fancy the way the cook prepared certain dishes were in the habit of emptying their plates into handkerchiefs and other receptacles, and then depositing the contents in odd spots, including a hole in the wall of the basement passage. Rats killed one of the peacocks, and one unfortunate lad in Puffing Billy had his end-of-term dorm feast ruined because he woke when the party started to find that there was a rat in bed with him, having its own feast. I think that the falling numbers were undoubtedly the main reason why we left the Abbey, but I'm sure that the rats will have played some part in the decision to transfer the juniors to Westward Ho once again, as also the row with the Stuckleys over the picture. I do not think you've mentioned that Mr. and Mrs. de Maresque were assisted by their daughter, or was it daughters? They were very much involved on the matroning of the school. The matron before the war had been a charming Quaker lady named Miss Coates, who had not come to Hartland and perhaps left the school at the start of the war. The only warlike noise I recall in our time at Hartland was the explosion of a mine on the rocks near the quay. We walked over to see what there was to be seen, but I do not think there were any traces. On another occasion, a coaster got in difficulties on these rocks, and we went to see it. The cliffs being quite high near there, one could see Lundy Island on a clear day. A Dornier flew up the river at Bideford one day. Any account ought to include a few words on the subject of bullying. It was never rife, but in all schools there tend to be bullies, I would assume, and this was no exception. It might be fair to say that there was exceptionally little of it, and most of it was trivial. The more frightening face of the thing was the occasional instance of the pack instinct, not led by the bullies and not directed at those normally bullied. One normally popular boy was once taken into the woods by the pack, made to strip entirely, and then to run through a large bed of full-grown nettles. On another occasion the pack chose as its victim a boy who tended to be one of the pugnacious type, but not a bully. He was cornered in a basement room, stripped and scrubbed with a dry scrubbing brush, and then shut in a tin cabin trunk. No doubt a modern psychologist would find all sorts of explanations for these episodes, but they were totally isolated and non-recurrent incidents. The victims stood their tests manfully and bore no visible grudge afterwards, being once again normally accepted members of the community. A slightly different incident was a round-robin complaint letter signed by a lot of the boys concerning one of the mistresses. I do not recollect what we complained of. I know she resigned on the strength of it, and that she addressed us in a dignified manner before her departure, at which point we all felt thoroughly ashamed of ourselves. But this odd side of human behaviour seems to be limited to that age group, I have no recollections of similar episodes in the senior school. Indeed, the erstwhile bullies had grown out of such behaviour with the passage of the years. As a final Hartland note, therefore, let me mention the rood screen in St. Nectan's. It was an intricate piece of work in a church of great merit, and well worth a visit whenever one is in the district. What I want to reach in due course are the similar recollections of other people who were there. It will be so interesting to have one's memory jogged about forgotten incidents, and it will also be useful for you to have a wide selection of memoirs on which to draw for your second edition. A pity that none of us can enlarge for you on the staff and management points of view.